Right, hello, my name's Ross Bradshaw from Five Leaves Bookshop in Nottingham. We are variously in Quebec and in Nottingham. And this is the first of a series of 6 events organised by Five Leaves Bookshop involving 6 UNESCO Cities of Literature. The 6 cities in question are Nottingham, where we are based, Quebec, where we are, Seattle, Nanjing, Lviv, we are visiting twice, and Jakarta. Each of those events features a writer who is local to us or that we have published, and a writer from the cities that we're visiting, 12 writers in all. It's been a great fun project to set up. This is the first of the series, since as well as the 12 writers, we've built a relationship with local hosts, local UNESCO Cities of Literature. We've worried about the different languages, interpreters, different time zones. And I want to thank my colleague Pippa Hennessy for pulling it all together. This event is live, but most of the viewers will be seeing this on YouTube and various other online channels in the 6 countries involved. If you're unaware of the UNESCO Cities of Literature, there are 42 of us, spanning 28 countries and 6 continents. Those of you who are fans of the, well, I'm not sure if you would call him speculative fiction writer, Douglas Adams, well, certainly a humorous writer, but you will have noticed that there are 42 cities of literature, because in Douglas Adams' land, the answer was always 42. One of the purposes of this series is to encourage international reading and to build links over the world between organizations, writers, and indeed bookshops. But even with our own cohorts, we are international. One of our writers, not today, was born in India, another in the Caribbean. And I think that's the case with some of the other countries that we're visiting as well, that people don't necessarily stay in the one country. People move around and bring those experiences. I should say something about our own City of Literature in brief. Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature. Its slogan is "Use the power of words to transform lives," creates new opportunities and establish Nottingham as a destination for lovers of books. They want to encourage Nottingham people to read more, to write more, and enjoy words. This summer, they ran a Big City Reads campaign, giving away books aimed at young people. And they work a lot on youth engagement, aiming to work with thousands of young people across the city. This year, Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature will host Slamavision, an international slam poetry competition held amongst the 42 cities of literature. Last year, Nottingham was the champion of that, with Cara Thompson's winning poem, Island Screams, which coincidentally, Five Leaves has just published in a book about Black lives in Nottingham. So that's where we are. We want to nurture a culture of storytelling and build a better world with words. Tonight we have 2 science fiction writers, George Mann from Nottingham, who you'll see, and Sylvain Neuvel from Quebec. That's Quebec as in French language Quebec, but tonight most of the event will be in English. I'm hoping there will be a soupçon of French going around. Both writers have a large reputation in their own countries, and Sylvain is also published in English by Penguin. The format of the evening is that I will pass very quickly on to Quebec, to Claudine, who will talk a little about Quebec City of Literature and introduce Sylvain. He'll then read for about 5 minutes, and then we return to the UK for George Mann, and then we'll have the writers in conversation with Claudine and I asking some questions. If you also want to ask questions at any time, if you put a note in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also add material on the chat, but we will see the chat, but the speakers may not. So if it's a direct question, please put it in Q&A. We'll end the evening with a short reading by both writers and wrap up the whole thing about an hour from now. So over to Claudine.
Thank you, Russ. So I will start with a soupçon de français to talk a little bit about Quebec City as ville UNESCO de littérature. Donc, berceau de la francophonie en Amérique du Nord et capitale du Québec, la ville de Québec est reconnue internationalement pour ses paysages inspirants, son dynamisme culturel et la richesse de son patrimoine. Et on connaît bien le Vieux-Québec, qui est d'ailleurs inscrit sur la liste du patrimoine mondial depuis 1985. C'est en 2017 que la municipalité a rejoint le réseau des villes créatives de l'UNESCO dans le domaine de la littérature, et c'est la première ville francophone à obtenir cette désignation. C'est une reconnaissance de son exceptionnelle vitalité littéraire et celle de Wendake aussi, chef-lieu in situ de la nation Huron-Wendat. Et cette désignation, donc, concrétise surtout l'engagement de la ville envers les arts littéraires et leur capacité à construire des communautés plus unies. And we might, I think, mention the several literary festivals and events that take place every year in Quebec City. Aside from the very large Salon du Livre, we also have several festivals that carve out a space for writers and poets, among which we find Québec en toutes lettres, le Festival Caniche, tout nouveau de l'année passée, the Imagination Festival, Une ville, un livre, etc., etc. And I name all of these cultural and literary events and organizations, which are in addition to institutions like La Maison de la Littérature, who is also sponsoring this event, and the Morin Center, of course, its geographical neighbor. The independent bookstores also should be mentioned, and here I would like to specifically mention La Maison Anglaise, which is an institution in Quebec City. It's been around since 1984, and it is Quebec City's only locally owned and independent English language bookstore. So hats off to La Maison Anglaise. We should mention the several publishing companies as well, and more than 200 writers in Quebec City and in Wendake who embody every day the spirit of Quebec City, UNESCO City of Literature. And actually, Quebec has a very long-standing tradition, a literary tradition. Perhaps now is a good time to mention that this tradition goes way, way back. Quebec City is the place where the first Canadian novel was written, and I would even say the first North American novel was written. Frances Brooke, History of Emily Montagu, which is an epistolary novel. Now, along the way, several notable authors have lived and written and continue to live and write here in Quebec City. And this is my cue to introduce Sylvain Neuvel, which I do with great pleasure. Sylvain Neuvel was born here in Quebec City, and he was raised in the suburb of l'Ancienne Lorette. And several of your bios mentioned this, Sylvain. He dropped out of high school at 15, but clearly he went back because he got his PhD from the University of Chicago, a PhD in linguistics. I'm going to read to you the title of his dissertation. Metamorphology, a word-based account of polysynthesis and other multivalent morphological relations. Now, I had to look up most of the words in here, and I'm still not sure I understand. So more on that maybe later, and its relationship to your vision of science fiction, maybe. But along the way, he has done several things. He's been a journalist. He's worked in soil decontamination. He's sold ice cream in California. He has taught linguistics in India. He is also a certified translator, though apparently he wishes he was an astronaut. And he has written several good books, great books. One complete trilogy, the Themis Files trilogy, which includes the first installment, Sleeping Giants, the second, Waking Gods, and the third one, Only Human. From this series, Sleeping Giants was a finalist for the 2016 Goodreads Choice Awards for Best Science Fiction. The book was also a finalist for the 2017 Compton Crook Award, finalist for the Concordia University First Book Prize, and it won the 2018 Seiyun Award. In 2017, he published The Test, which is a novella, And then in 2021, he began a second trilogy, the Take Them to the Stars trilogy, of which the first installment is called A History of What Comes Next. And the second installment was published just this year under the title Until the Last of Me. His personal interests include tinkering and dabbling in robotics and science fiction, obviously. He's obsessed with Halloween. He is currently apparently building a working R2-D2 replica, so maybe more on that later as well. And he writes about aliens and giant robots as an excuse to build action figures for his son, Theodore. And he has, last thing, I promise, he has 2 cats, and one of them is named Jin Erso, and the other one is named Laura Roslin, after one of my favorite characters in Battlestar Galactica. So thank you so much, Sylvain, for being here with us.
Merci. Merci beaucoup de me recevoir. Bonjour à tous les gens de Québec. It's a pleasure to be here. The cats are also happy. She has a title, though. Her name is President Laura Roslin. You don't want to insult her. But it's my pleasure to join you all today. It's fun. Wouldn't hold my breath on the R2-D2, though.
And I think you're going to read an excerpt for us?
I will. I am going to read a short excerpt from the first book of the Take Him to the Stars trilogy called History of What Comes Next, which takes place in the early days of the space race. And this is from chapter 2, where the main character, Mia, is in Germany and meets Werner von Braun. It's called The Honey Dripper. Sit down, Lily. I'll be back in a minute. He doesn't speak a lick of English, but all I hear is Cary Grant. He's all smiles and graces. I don't think he ever turns off the charm. This is a man who likes to be liked. I wouldn't be surprised if he slept with half the secretarial staff here. His office is meant to impress. Mahogany desk, fancy carpet, wall-to-wall bookshelves. The room belongs at Oxford, not in a concrete building littered with metal scraps. I suppose most of this would feel normal if it weren't for the war outside, but right now it reeks of denial. This is wall-to-wall pretend, like a movie set. He's made himself the star of his little world. Guess all I need now is to convince him I deserve a role in it, only I don't know how. I sure don't feel like Katharine Hepburn. I feel like a child. I certainly look like one. I cut my hair. I don't know why I did it. I was leaving for Germany the next day. There were a million things to do, but I went out and got my hair cut. There's this fancy salon not far from our house. I walk by it almost every day. I see rich people coming out of there, and they look so happy, confident. I wanted that. I never wanted it before, but I did then. Going on a secret mission for the government, it was scary but exciting. I wanted to feel special. Shoulder length and bangs. As soon as I saw myself in the mirror, I knew I'd been lying to myself all along. It was stupid, really. I told myself I wanted to feel special, but I wanted to feel different. It's the first time I do anything on my own. Me, just me. I didn't want to look like my mother. Now I look like my mother when she was a teenager. I am sure I inspire about as much confidence as I have in myself. I don't think I'd follow me if I were in Von Braun's fancy shoes. Not like my mother. Funny. Who else is there? I don't even know why I'm what I am without her. I don't know why I can force a door open without breaking a sweat, why I find people more cryptic than differential equations. Mother is the only person I relate to. I am exactly like her. I look like her, think like her. There is nothing but my mother. I spend my life following the rules she taught me, pursuing one goal she taught me to pursue. Take them to the stars before evil comes and kills them all. My mother's words, her mother's words, and her mother's, and her mother's. Our lives boil down to a single sentence, a handful of symbols on an ancient piece of jewelry. I thought it was a gift when mother said I could wear it. Now that necklace hangs heavy like a manacle. The world is doomed, and we must get people off of it. That's what's important. Not this war, not the first one or the next one, not the woman in the river. Our fight is against gravity, and Fawn Brown can help us win it. Mother said all that, of course. She's the one who believes. I only know we're the same, so I follow. Maybe that's how it's supposed to work. Voila.
Thanks, Sylvain. Could you remind us which book you were reading from?
This is from A History of What Comes Next, which came out in early 2021.
I have somewhere about the desk. I would wave it. I would wave it, but maybe I'll wave it. Maybe I'll wave that later. So we're back in England, and want to introduce George Mann. George's Wikipedia entry is utterly exhausting because he's done so much and worked in so many different forms. So he's written graphic novels, Doctor Who novels, edited science fiction collaborations on a wider canvas than steampunk, which I'll come to in a second. He's going to be reading from Albion Initiative. Steampunk may not be something that people are familiar with. Usefully, 2 days ago on Twitter, I saw a definition of steampunk. I have no idea who wrote it. Might have been George. It said, steampunk is a style of design and fashion that combines historical elements with anachronistic technological features inspired by science fiction. The essence of steampunk is homage to vintage fashion with a modern, sassy twist. As you will notice, George is wearing what looks like his favorite cardigan. That is not steampunk dress, and I've already got him into trouble for not dressing the part tonight. George, apart from his novels, he also has a great interest in gaming, and if you look closely at his screen, you'll find a gaming table at the background, which is rather a mess. He claims it's rather a mess, looks very tidy to me. And over his right shoulder, yes, his right shoulder, are a pile of DVDs, Doctor Who audio tapes that he's been involved with. He's a big fan of Doctor Who. So tonight he's going to read a little from the Albion Initiative. I should say that George is currently missing his son, who's gone off to university 2 weeks ago, and really we need to give him a lot of support here, because his life has changed in so many ways since his son has gone off to university. So we'll try to, by mentioning it, we'll try to take your mind off it. So as you are, George, Albion Initiative, please.
Thank you. So I'm afraid, so I am going to read some of Albion Initiative a little bit later, but I've actually, the first extract I'm going to read is from a book called Broken Things, which is a recent dark fantasy novella, and then the steampunk to follow a bit later. So this is the introduction of a character called Palla. He's a knightly character from a knightly order, and his young female squire, Ston. Palla opened his eyes, winced, and then rolled onto his side to avoid the lancing spears of sunlight intent upon searing his mind. The room took a moment to catch up. His stomach bulked, threatening to void itself. He fought down the urge, sucking at the air through dry, cracked lips. His tongue felt like a rattan mat. "It's time to get up, my lord." Palla groaned at the sound of the woman's voice. What was Ston doing here in his room? In fact, come to think of it, where exactly was here? He didn't even remember taking a room. "Here, some water." Ston pushed the flagon towards his face. Palla winced again. "Yes, all right, Ston. Give me a moment." "It's almost noon," said Ston, and Palla couldn't help but pick up the insinuating tone. "You should have been up hours ago." "What of it?" He stifled another groan as he pushed himself up onto his elbow. The room swam. He tried to focus on Ston, who was kneeling beside his bed, eyes narrowed in disapproval. "You don't remember, do you?" "Remember what?" Palla snatched the proffered flagon from Ston's grasp and gulped down the tepid liquid. It eased his dry throat and lips, but felt as if it was curdling whatever was in his stomach. "What the prophet told you last night in the bar." "That sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, Ston." The squire sighed and got to her feet. It's probably for the best, she said, picking up his discarded clothes. Pala slumped back into the soft caress of the pillow. The prophet. Now she came to mention it, there was a half-remembered thought lingering in the back of his mind. He closed his eyes, tried to concentrate. A woman, dark-skinned, beautiful, a tattooed throat like a spider web, riding him like a bucking horse in this very bed. No, that came later. A filthy gutter snipe who stank of piss, one blind eye, milky and glazed, one sharp as a thief's dagger, a gap-toothed smile, coins crossing palms. This prophet, he looked like a shit-smeared child. Pala peered at Ston, who was by the foot of the bed now, stuffing Pala's clothes into the travelling case. No, that was the homeless boy you paid to fetch her from the temple. So she was the dark-skinned woman with the tattoo. Wrong again, my lord. That was the woman who emptied your purse and fled after you passed out midway through. All right. So it wasn't her. He rubbed a hand over his chin. It was rough with half a day's worth of bristles. Hold on, she robbed me. He sat up, immediately wishing he hadn't. Ston shrugged. Well, you were rather indiscreet with your coin, if I recall. Everyone at the inn knew you'd just been paid for the Droga job. Pala tried to circle back through the jumbled events that were now crowding his memory. He had a sudden sharp recollection of buying everyone a drink, the whole bar, waving his coin around like it was going out of fashion. He winced. He'd basically invited them to rob him. But that was after the prophet, wasn't it? This prophet, what did they say? Ston closed the travelling case and turned to look at him. She was holding a clean set of breeches and a folded shirt. She tossed them on the bed. Are you sure you want to know? Well, of course I want to know. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. She told you, in a typically cryptic and portentous way, about a keep a few leagues from here, where a goddess has recently been reborn. Pala had a sudden vision of a bald-headed woman with scarified patterns upon her cheeks and a smear of green dye across her eyelids and the bridge of her nose. The woman was leaning forward, breathing heavily through rotted teeth. She was repeating a name, slowly and loudly. Amaranth. Pala shivered. A worthy foe for a knight of Perish. Ston nodded. That's what you said last night, right before you declared to the whole inn that you were setting out this morning to challenge her to mortal combat. Pala remembered cheering and more drinks. That was when he'd met the woman who'd robbed him. Well, perhaps I was a trifle optimistic, eh? He threw the sheets aside and swung his legs out of the bed. Across the room, Ston visibly winced. What? Oh, he grabbed the breeches and tugged them on while Ston turned her back. She didn't steal my underwear too, did she? What? No, of course not. Why would she? Well, some people like that kind of thing. Perhaps she wanted a trophy, a reminder of her conquest. More likely she wanted to get out of here as quickly as possible. Pala stood, tugging on his shirt. It's all right, you can turn around now. Your dignity is preserved. It's not my dignity I'm worried about, said Ston.
Thanks, George. Could you wave the book and tell us the title again, just in case we want to follow it up?
It's Broken Things.
When's this come out? We don't have this yet in the bookshop.
So this was published by a small independent press called PS Publishing, who specialise in kind of small signed limited edition print runs. So it was a book I wrote during the pandemic. Came out end of last year, I think.
I've just realised that Claudine and I never worked out a plan for questions. So I'm going to go first and you can go second, and then we'll play it by ear. And hopefully Sylvain and George will be able to interrogate each other as well. But may I start with a question to both of you, that both of you create new worlds or old worlds, and you deal in speculative fiction. So much does writing about what isn't real tell us about what is real?
Who wants to take that first?
Neither of you, I think.
It's a good meaty question to start with. I think. Well, I'll try and go first. I think for me, everything I write is about life as I observe it. It's about what's going on around me, and I can't help but be influenced by the things I'm seeing, the issues that I'm concerned about in life. A good example of that is a graphic novel that was published earlier this year called Mother Bridge, which is a fantasy story set in a post-utopia, a utopia that's kind of gone wrong. So it was a utopian for a while, and then things have disintegrated, and it's very much a fantasy story, but it's heavily politicized in the sense that it's about immigration, it's about border walls, it's about the environment, and and how we protect the planet going forward. But wrapped up in a kind of modern mythology and a mythical tale about the natural world and about kind of creatures of ancient myth, and I want one woman's journey to get back to her family in that context, in this strange new world. And so for me, everything I create stems from those kind of things, whether I want them to or not. It's those influences are there in my mind, and whether I'm writing a crime story or something that's a Star Wars story, or something that I've created from scratch, it's I can't help but carry that stuff with me, even when I've tried not to. If I set out to go, right, I'm just going to write a great traditional Doctor Who story, you find, well, actually, when you scratch the surface of something like Doctor Who, that's all very issue based anyway. The writers at the time were writing stories about politics and about the world that was around them, and they were yes, they had monsters in them and they were great runarounds for kids, but there was another level you could watch those stories at. And I think naturally that's how I approach a story.
Yeah, I was going to say that I don't think it's possible to write any sort of fiction without really writing about us. It's all we do. I mean, there's no escaping it. My first trilogy is about, well, you could say it's about giant robots and aliens and whatnot, but really it's about human nature. There's no way to write a story that doesn't touch on who we are and what we are, the values we share or we hope to share. Yeah, I mean, you hear often, science fiction is a metaphor for today's world and whatnot, and it's been true like since the beginning of science fiction, but it's true of everything. I mean, there's no writing that is not about what it means to be us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a primal thing, isn't it? So I think humans have always told stories, and they've always told stories to try and understand the world that they're in, and I think that's what we're still doing.
Yeah.
So I have a follow-up to that question, which is, well, I think that's absolutely true, that literature of all kind helps us to talk about the world that we live in today. What does speculative fiction or fantasy or science fiction give us as a tool that is different from other genres? Is it that it also offers us the imagination that we need to solve some of these issues? Or I'm super curious.
I guess I'll start with this one. Well, I think for me anyway, writing science fiction allows you sometimes to sort of take a more roundabout way of talking about things, and it's not even when you want to tackle an issue that's super important to you, sometimes just shoving it in someone's face, you're not going to get the reaction you're hoping to get. Science fiction has the ability to sort of, I guess, trick people into into thinking about things they weren't open to thinking about before. Star Trek, green people and the faith of the blue people and so on. And now you start talking about, okay, maybe this is a metaphor for something. But at first, everyone will agree that, the blue people deserve life and respect like any other being. And they're all, yeah. And then you push that thought a little further and you realize, oh, now I'm talking about racism. I didn't want to think about that and so on. Yeah. So trick.
I absolutely agree, and I think the other thing it allows us to do is to take characters, because whatever character you're writing, they're a human character, whether they've got blue skin or green skin or they're a goblin or whatever it is, they're a human character because we write humans, and I think it allows us to put them in different, perhaps more extreme situations as well, and look at how that they respond. In a way that, I mean, of course, you can put someone in an extreme situation in a contemporary novel, but then it reads a bit like the news sometimes to me, because there's horrible stuff going on everywhere in the world, and I think what this allows us to do is to take a character and put them and dial some of those things up, like, for example, the climate crisis, and to go, okay, well, let's look at what the world might look like after that's happened. If we don't stop it, what's going to happen, and how are those people going to survive, and what's life going to be like for them? And that does what Sylvain says, that it allows us to then communicate, if not a piece of kind of accurate futurology, the emotional element of it, the story to people, so they can understand, well, okay, this is what the future, even if it doesn't look specifically like this, it's what people might have to live through if we don't do the things we need to do now.
Sort of two ways of entrapping the reader. Yeah, I really like that. Ross, I'm just going to ask a quick question, and then it's back to you. But as a follow-up on this, just one of the things that you said, Sylvain, in an interview was that Sleeping Giants was, amongst other things, a book about what happens when we become conscious that there is somebody else out there. Is that discovery going to bring us together, or is it going to rip us apart? And I wonder what your thoughts are, George and Sylvain, on what would happen right now if we encounter, what would happen to our world if tomorrow we realized that there is an alien race. Do you think that we are more likely at this point in time? Do you think that we're more likely to come together or to be ripped apart?
It's bad timing. I mean, I'm not super optimistic about the human race right now, but it will, I'll get back to a more pleasant state of mind, I suppose, later. Right now, I don't think we handled it well. We can't handle people who were like suffering in horrible conditions coming over and living with us because the color of their skin is slightly darker than what we're used to, or because they don't wear the same clothes. I don't think we're exactly ready for Little Green Man and possibly scientifically advanced civilization. I think we'd freak out and try to blow them up. It would take about a day.
Yeah, I have to agree. Unfortunately, I think I think we're living in a world at the moment where the governments of the world aren't necessarily representative of a lot of the people and their people's beliefs. So we end up in a position where there will be people taking decisions that might not be representative of the mass feeling about things. I also think it's quite a cynical position, but I think there is a potential that it would bring humanity together in opposition to the enemy. I think there's a point where we might look at each other and go, well, actually, you look a lot more like me than they do, so let's stick together. It's still a very cynical way of looking at things, but yeah, I'd like to think we can get to a place where we're ready for that. I hope. I'm not sure it would be great at the moment.
Mm-hmm. One of the early British acts of Parliament to try to keep people out of this country was called the Aliens Act. So alien is an interesting word historically. We've had a question from a viewer. The NASA DART mission feels like science fiction becoming reality. Does this type of event inspire your works? Sylvain, you have an interest in being an astronaut, and also the Big Lebowski, by the way. If viewers have noticed the resemblance between Sylvain and the Big Lebowski, who, if you don't know Lebowski, he's a film character that looks like Sylvain. The way that he currently looks is quite deliberate. We may come on to that later. But let's stick to the question that the viewer has asked about the poor little asteroid that was tootling around, minding its own business, and gets whacked by NASA.
Yeah, I love the DART thing. Yeah, and I mean, we moved it a little bit, but I'm always interested, especially since I started writing this series, that is where the second book came out. Now it's all about the space race, and I was interested in space exploration when I started this, but like anyone else. I didn't know anything about anything. So I had to learn, well, everything from the physics to the people involved to the events that sort of shaped all this and what the politics behind it were, so that things that could have happened didn't happen, and so on and so forth. And so when I see, especially nowadays with what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, when you see art's not one of those things, but when you see cooperation, like on the ISS or whatever, it's sort of one of the few things that sort of give you a little bit of hope about the human race and what we're capable of doing. But yeah, I follow space stuff pretty closely. It's one of the few areas where we still get good news every now and then. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not so kind of inspired directly by the more kind of science end of things. I'm much more kind of myths and folklore, and when I write science fiction, it tends to be science fantasy, really, like Star Wars. But I'm just pleased we're doing stuff like this, because I think, you know, our long-term future depends on it. So it's inspirational in that sense. They're very much so, that, you know, it's people looking obviously at protecting the planet and being able to divert asteroids. But also, the more we're getting out into space and exploring, it feels like, you know, we're potentially opening up new frontiers for humanity to spread out, and I think that's going to be important. And
actually, Sylvain, you said something that triggered another question in me, which is that one of the things I thought was very interesting about your novel, History of What Comes Next, is that the last part is all about what you learned during the time that you were writing the book, but didn't fit into the book. So all of this actual history and how you encountered it. And you are absolutely right. It was much more interesting than I thought. And I read it as avidly as I read the rest of your novel. And that brings me to my question, which is that for this trilogy, you have, instead of looking towards the future, you've gone to the past, and you're trying to write a story in a rather strict carcan, right? You're trying to write a story, but the parameters are already there and you can't move them. The historical parameters are already there. You can't move them. And George, the same thing is true when you write in a specific universe, whether it's Doctor Who or Star Wars, or you write within these strict parameters. And I wonder how creativity gets impacted by these imposed limits.
I suppose I can answer that one first. I actually find it sometimes it helps, because instead of just looking at a white page, there's some walls to bounce off when you're starting to come up with stories and ideas. My approach has always been, when writing in someone else's kind of established universe, it's always been about getting the tone right rather than the specifics. Now, I mean, and yes, you do have to get the specifics right, but there are people to help with that as well. And I think, you know, first and foremost, it needs to feel like a Star Wars story or a Doctor Who story, or, you know, whatever it is you're writing, Sherlock Holmes story. And story comes first, rule of cool, you know. Like, I'll always pitch the idea, and sometimes it'll come back and, you know, it'll fall over because they say you can't really do that. With, you know, you're pushing too hard against the established bounds. But often they'll come back and go, yeah, that's great. The thing that you can't do is you can't have that colored lightsaber in it. And you go, oh wow, okay. So it's, you know, I can't have a purple lightsaber, but I can go and do this whole new story that I didn't think I was going to get away with. And that's very much been my experience, particularly with Star Wars, where they kind of go, oh yeah, this is, you know, this is a great story, and it's got a great emotional content to it. Let's roll with it. Let's push the boundaries a little bit, and we'll make it work. We'll massage the bits that need to be massaged. But in terms of kind of setting out to tell those stories, I find it useful. It's like, a friend of mine who was very heavily involved in the creation of the High Republic, which is an area of Star Wars that I'm writing in at the moment. It's kind of before the prequel series. He was very heavily involved in the origination of it, and he talked about, and I think this is very true. He talked about kind of going into it and going, right, okay, Jedi are supposed to be these characters that never get scared. So what scares them? And that became the question that kind of bled into the whole of the High Republic. What scares the Jedi? And so we've approached the story writing with that in mind. And that, I think it's cool because because then you are pushing against hype. You're pushing against these things you've seen and going, let's expand it, let's grow. I always want what I write in another universe to be additive rather than just filling in gaps or repeating beats that you've seen on the screen already. It feels like, if I'm going to write a story, it needs to say something new. So sometimes you can find that those constraints help you find the bit you're looking for. That's certainly my experience.
Same here. I'm usually stimulated by them. I mean, most of them are self-imposed for me. I mean, my first trilogy is basically 100% unattributed dialogue. And that was the fun of it. Like, can you write a book with just people talking to each other without ever directly saying who's actually talking? You just let the reader figure it out. It's like I introduce my dialogue with M dashes, which infuriates the copy editors, but it was super fun to write. I guess for the same reason, I guess maybe Twitter worked, because you were limited to, you had to say things within a certain number of characters. So when I started writing A History of What Comes Next, again, self-imposed idea, I wanted all the events in the book to be real, like all of them. I just shoved fictional characters into them, and so it's not an alternate history, it's a secret history. And it was super fun, but again, just difficult, but it's sort of what made the book interesting. I had to sort of steer away from that as I move forward with the series. It's more driven by the characters themselves and by historical events now, but it was interesting. It's funny because the one thing that I wrote where I felt I had the most freedom was the little bit of Star Wars that I did. I wrote a short story for Insider magazine. They're canon, and this was before the new movies came out. And prior to that, Star Wars was, black and white. The bad people were told you they were bad people. Come to the dark side. So there was no gray in there, no room for gray, no nothing. And what I wrote was 100% the opposite of that. Is about the life of a stormtrooper, and it's just gray from beginning to end, and it's dark. And I thought there is no way they'll let me publish it, but they went with it. Again, the only thing they said is, no, you can't have kyber crystals here. And I was like, yeah, whatever, I'll put in another rock. And that was it. But that's the most, I think, free writing I've done is within someone else's IP.
I have to find that story. That sounds cool. But yeah, but I totally get you. I think some of the most fun I've ever had is self-imposed constraints, where I said I'm going to write a small collection of stories and they're all precisely 100 words. That's it. And I did. I ended up making it into kind of an advent calendar. There was one a day throughout December, and it was huge amounts of fun, because it's like I ended up. Part of it was an exercise in economy, where you really think about every single word, and part of it was an exercise in creativity. It's like, well, how wild can I go in 100 words and still have a cohesive little story or emotional beat or something? So I love doing that sort of thing.
There's a question, actually moving back to Sylvain, from somebody, Jean-René Roja, to Jetty Sylvain. You end in the audible "No kindness too soon" on a bar spectacularly high. Bravo. Can you hint the direction of the final book of your current trilogy without giving us any spoilers? So say something, but say nothing at the same time.
Yeah, it's going to be tough. Thank you for plugging No Kindness Too Soon. As another exercise with its own constraints. I wrote an Audible exclusive, and it was fun. I mean, like I said, I'd written unattributed dialogue a lot before. So in some ways it was similar, but it was also a lot more freedom, because you can do things with audio that you can't do without cheating a bit on paper, because the characters have their own voice, literally. So you don't need to exaggerate the differences between them, and you can have more than two people in a room without it getting complicated. So it was super fun to write, and I was pretty proud of the ending. So thank you for mentioning it. As for the last book, it's called For the First Time Again. God, it'd be hard to talk about it without spoiling anything, but yeah, I leave people at the end of the second book in a very, I guess, situation that seems dire and perhaps hopeless. I will say there is always hope. Those who've read my other books know that you shouldn't expect necessarily the happiest of endings, but I'm pretty happy with what I did with it. And it was one of the most fun. The main character is one of the most fun characters I've had to write, and I've had to write really good ones, I think. But I can't wait for everyone to meet her. I think you're going to have a good time.
Claudine, do you want to?
Well, I was wondering if we could use this question to springboard onto point of view, because the second installment, Until the Last of Me, presents more of a more diverse point of view. It's always first person, but we've got the dyad of Lola and her mother, but on the other hand, we also have Samael, who in whose head we are more often, and I think that multiplicity is pointing towards something also. But and that leads me to a question about point of view. When you set off to write a story, do you ever change? I mean, do you ever think, oh, this is the wrong point of view. I don't want this person telling this person's story. I want the person telling her own story. Or in the case of the first trilogy, did you start in the first or the third and think, no, I want an objective point of view that's going to give me no insight into the minds of my characters except for what they're saying?
Well, for the first trilogy, that was the goal. That was to have the most possible, the most objective point of view that I could get. And I tried different things at the beginning. I tried from one character's POV who would have, like, I don't know, a more balanced approach to everything. And then when I thought about the interviewer as a character, everything sort of clicked into place, and I could tell the story entirely in dialogue, which I think is the most objective way to tell a story. I don't think there's a more objective one than that, because it's pretty much exactly like real life. You get to form your own opinion of the characters and figure out what's going on based on what they're saying, what they're not saying, how they're saying it, or whatnot. And there's no one really sort of like feeding you insider information to make the process easier. And structuring those books took forever, because even within that objective scheme, I still needed to know who was talking to who. And so it was always about, like, who's the best person to talk about this? And do I talk about it while it's happening, before it's happening, after it's happening, and let people figure out that it happened, and so on and so forth. So I spent more time structuring that book than I did writing it. What came afterwards was a lot easier in terms of POV. The test, for example, is from the point of view of someone going through a citizenship test in the UK. And it's their point of view. It was clear from the beginning, and there was no real interesting way to play with that. And the new series is about, genetically, 100 generations of genetically identical mothers and daughters messing with our history. So it was clear that I was gonna have to shift from mother to daughter. And by book 2, I wanted to include the bad guys in there as well, because again, you go from things that appear to be black and white at first to shades of gray the farther the series goes on. Does that answer your question? I'm sort of at this like good way to end.
It does. No, it's given me a better insight. But I disagree. In the test, you do something a little bit funky. You have the POV, that first person for the person who's undergoing the test, but then you have the person who's administering the test, and then we have a third limited. So you oscillate, you switch back and forth in terms of who's telling the story. That seems really it's interesting to me. And I wonder, George, do you want to tell us maybe a few words about how you decide who's telling the story that you want to tell?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so with prose, which is predominantly what I write, it usually the character usually tells me as I start writing. You know, I usually know, because I'm a planner rather than a pantser, to use the phrase. So I plan the story. So I have quite a long gestation period on a project. So I know whose story it's going to be when I start writing. I have been surprised before by things, and particularly when I'm writing a crime plot. So I've done several kind of crime thrillers or mystery novels, and you have to start thinking really carefully about who's revealing which part of the story in which order. And how you play with unreliable points of view and characters reinforcing the red herrings and things like that. But perhaps more interesting in the work I've done, it comes from writing audio, like Sylvain has mentioned, and comic books, and actually animation, where it's a collaborative process. So you've got an actor or an artist, or in an animation, you've got actors and artists. So the piece of work that you're writing isn't for the end user, it's for another creator to interpret, to turn into the piece of art at the end. And I've often found, especially with comics and an animation, where you're writing a series and you start to get things back, where you get the first few pages of a comic, or the first issue of a comic, or the first episode of an animation series, and you realize, oh, actually that's the standout character, isn't it? Because the performance has pulled, they're like, these magnets that pull everything in, and you go, oh no, this is the standout performance, they're outshining everything that I intended. Or in the art, it's like, no, this is the character that people are latching onto. And comics are like old-fashioned serial fiction in that sense. You've got, especially if you've got the grace of like a year's worth, 12 months worth of comics to tell a story, you can start to change the story as you go, because you realize, actually, this is the character that readers are latching onto, or this is the performance that's selling it back to me. So you start writing for that actor rather than writing for the character that was in your head, and it becomes a very different experience, and changes and morphs the project, which I find happens a lot more in those mediums than it does with a novel, where I tend to sit down and go, by the point I start writing, I pretty much know the direction of travel, and then I kind of describe it as it's like coiling a spring. I'll spend several months, 6 months, coiling this spring up, where it's all in my head, and then suddenly it unsprings, and I do a first draft really quickly. Then I put it in a drawer, and then I come back to it, and then go through the process of rewriting it. And there is occasions during that rewriting process where you go, oh, okay, I've got, I'm telling the wrong bit of the story here, or I've got the cameras pointing in the wrong people, and you start shifting things around. But more often than not, it's a more straightforward process.
And I like what you said there. Am I pointing the camera in the right direction? You're using cinematic language to talk about writing. And I wonder if I can use that opportunity to ask another question about transmediality and adaptation, actually. Do you think about other media when you are writing? Are you inspired by other media, and do you envision other media as adaptations of your text? And Sylvain, I know that several of your works were taken up for adaptation, though we have yet to see the product. I've still got my fingers crossed. But you also included a playlist in the reading to accompany the reading of a history of what comes next and the follow-up. So are you thinking in other media while you're writing?
You both will have to, sorry, I hate to do this, but you both will have to answer shortly, because the constraint that we've got is to do with the hour, and we want to fit in little readings from you both. So I hate to interrupt, but be brief.
All right. Let's do it quickly. I have to adapt myself to actually write a book because I sort of see things visually first, and some of it doesn't translate super well, like in a written medium. So beginning of Sleeping Giants, for example, we have that little girl in a hole in a giant metal hand, and you make a movie out of it. You just pan it up with the camera, and that's it. In the book, it doesn't work because she's the one talking about it, and she can't see herself from above. So you have to somehow bring a firefighter who took a picture of it, and so she can see it, so we can then describe the thing and have that point of view. So like the book itself is an adaptation of what I visually saw.
Very similar. I tend to be very heavily inspired by music. So my way into unlocking that, during that process I was talking about, where I'm thinking about the book, I find songs that fit the tone that I want, and they become a touchstone for me. So actually my process then when I'm writing is to get up in the morning and play those songs before I start writing. It kind of keys me back into it. I don't tend to think about adaptation. I do think visually, like Sylvain's described, but I don't think about adaptation, and it's a difficult process because like the other things I mentioned, audios, comics, etc. You go into them with a collaborative spirit. With a novel, it feels very personal, and then to have someone else go, no, I'm going to take it and change it and turn it into something else, and you kind of go, ooh, but you kind of have to go, well, you're the experts. You need to do it, translate it into your media, and make it yours. But because I still have the book, and you have to get in that headspace.
I feel really sorry that we're running out of time, because I think that the longer the event goes on, the more interesting it gets. I'm sure that we could happily spend another hour discussing the craft, and there are many things that we've not even touched on. I wanted to ask George about the editing process when he moves into being the editor for Solaris. I wanted to ask Sylvain about translation, and I wanted to ask Claudine more about the literary scene in Quebec. So I kind of hope that the final word later on will be au revoir rather than see you whenever. But I need to draw the event to a close. So I want to thank Claudine. I want to thank Quebec City of Literature. I want to thank Sylvain. I want to ask George. I want to thank my colleague Simon Griffiths, who's been looking after the tech in the background, and my colleague Pippa Hennessy, who set it up. George is going to read a final section, which this time
it's from the Alvin Initiative. Absolutely,
will be steampunk
novel.
And then Sylvain will, Claudine will say a few words, and then Sylvain will end with his reading. So George, please.
And this is the opening of the novel, the very first few half page, and it is just as the gang are kind of undercover, breaking into Bedlam to go and rescue the Prince of Wales, who they had incarcerated in a previous novel for trying to kill them. So they're now breaking him out because they need to replace Queen Victoria with him. Bedlam, in the dominion of hell, if the dominion of hell had ever found a footing on earth, it was here, confined within the towering walls of this palatial edifice, here where the warren-like corridors and treatment rooms echoed with the screams of the lost. This, Bainbridge knew, was a repository of nightmares, a storehouse of all the worst horrors that afflicted the empire. This was where the very worst criminals were sent to live out their days, to become objects of scientific study, observed, restrained, and experimented upon. Here, people went to become less than human, to disappear, and they had the gall to call it a hospital. Bainbridge stood in the courtyard, peering up at the foreboding building, while the carriage driver and the attendant nurse unloaded their passenger into a wheelchair behind him. Huge Tesla coils affixed to the roof either side of the the central dome, sparked in the mizzling rain, crackling with arcing light like a false dawn rising over the surrounding grounds. Light glowed in the serried rows of windows, and the distant echo of a wailing creature, man, woman, animal, Bainbridge couldn't tell, caused the hairs to prickle at the nape of his neck. "Come on, hurry it along," he said, turning to the nurse, who fussed over the slack-mouthed man in the wheelchair as she tucked a blanket across his lap. The patient was wearing a vacant expression, a bowler hat pulled low on his brow, obscuring much of his appearance from view. "Yes, sir," said the woman. "We'll be with you in a moment." Bainbridge nodded and turned his attention to the porticoed entrance. There were two porters loitering beside one of the columns, watching them with interest. Bainbridge raised the head of his cane in a gesture of greeting. The man on the left flashed a toothy grin by way of reply. "We're ready, sir," said the nurse from behind him. Very good, said Bainbridge. He glanced at the driver, who was clambering up the slick side of the carriage into his dicky box. His hair was plastered to his face. Driver, wait for us around the back. I don't anticipate this is going to take very long. Aye, sir, acknowledged the driver, cranking a lever. The vehicle's engine sputtered, and a spume of black smoke erupted from the spout of the exhaust vent. A few seconds later, the carriage rolled into motion, its engine chugging noisily as it trundled away into the night.
Thank you. Thank you so much, George and Sylvain. You've been so generous. And I'm sorry, Ross, I totally hijacked a lot of the questions I had.
No.
Questions, and I have more questions that I didn't get to ask. But I was going to end by asking what your Halloween costume was going to be. But we'll do that next time. For now, Sylvain is going to end with a reading also.
Thank you. This is from the second book in the series called Until the Last of Me. And this is Mia, who's now the mother, talking to her daughter Lola, who's 6 years old. We're moving because of the ancient gods. According to my charts, Uranus is catching up to Neptune now. We're just waiting on Saturn, then Jupiter will follow. It's happening, Lola. That really rare planetary alignment I told you about? It's happening 8 years from now. Can you believe it? We can see all the planets. We can visit them. The Greek and Roman gods are all coming together as in some prophecy. Like that book we're reading. The Chronicles of Narnia. I read her chapter every night before bed. Tarva, the Lord of Victory, salutes Alambil, the Lady of Peace. They are just coming to their nearest. I like how optimistic she is. My first thought was for the return of Cthulhu. Oh, it's better than the book, Lola. We can send the probe and see all the planets up close and personal. We can see what they're like for the very first time. We can take pictures. Wow. I know, but it's going to be hard and we don't have much time. How hard? Can I get a sip? Thank you. Imagine that Coca-Cola bottle is the Earth. The moon is the dime we used to buy it, 6 feet behind us in the vending machine. The moon is in the vending machine? Yes, it is. Mars is our bottle cap about 3 blocks from here. But we're not going to Mars, are we? Our first step is Jupiter. Where's Jupiter? Jupiter is a beach ball, those big ones, red, white, yellow, green, blue, about 2 miles from here. And we have to shoot our tiny, tiny probe at it. Tiny like a grain of sand? Oh, much smaller than that. Like a molecule.
Thanks, Sylvain. I think you can see that. That's the book that George Mann read from, the Albion Initiative, and this is the one that's at the top of my to-be-read list, History of What Comes Next, which seems appropriate if it's the top of your to-be-read list. If you're going to be following this series in consecutive time, not necessarily real time, next week we stay in North America. We go to Seattle, where we'll have a particular LGBT focus with Rachel Mann and Putsata Riang from the Elliott Bay Book Company and from Britain. Thereafter, we go to Nanjing, to Lviv, to Jakarta, and we end the series back in Lviv. Thank you for listening, whether you're live tonight or internationally on YouTube and other online platforms. Thanks for attending, and thanks to all of the people who've spoken tonight. Good night.